I didn't know it yet, but that phone call would end with my son in handcuffs. Your father doesn't understand how emergency situations work anymore. The voice came from the waiting room of the emergency department at St. Vincent's Hospital. I was sitting in a plastic chair near the vending machines, still wearing the flannel shirt I'd thrown on when the phone rang at 1:17 in the morning. My son Trevor had called, his voice tight with panic. "Dad, I need $8,500 right now. There's been an accident." I hadn't asked questions. I'd gotten dressed, grabbed my checkbook, and driven the 30 minutes to the hospital in the dark. Now I sat here waiting, while Trevor talked to someone around the corner in the registration area. "He's almost 70, Trevor continued. His voice carried that particular tone, the one you use when you're explaining something to people who already agree with you. "He still writes checks. He doesn't understand wire transfers or Venmo. I told him to bring cash, but he probably brought a checkbook from 1995. Laughter. 3 or 4 voices, all younger, all amused. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. The checkbook sat closed in my lap, the leather cover worn smooth from 40 years of use. I'd brought it because Trevor said he needed money for medical bills. Emergency surgery, he'd said. His girlfriend Alyssa had been in a car accident. I was 68 years old. I'd run my own accounting firm for 35 years before retiring. I understood wire transfers just fine. I also understood that at 1:17 in the morning, banks weren't open, and emergency rooms didn't demand payment before treatment. But I'd come anyway, because he was my son. Because when your child calls in the middle of the night saying someone's hurt, you don't ask questions, you just go. But I didn't interrupt. I sat in my plastic chair and listened. "The thing is," one of the other voices said, male mid-20s, trying to sound wise, "older people get confused about money. My grandfather's the same way. You ask for 5,000, he thinks you're robbing him." "Exactly," Trevor said. "I just need him to sign the check and go home. I'll handle the rest." I stood up slowly. My knees ached, old injury from a basketball game in college, but I moved without making noise. I walked toward the sound of the voices. Trevor was leaning against the reception desk, talking to 3 people, 2 young men in expensive sneakers and a woman in scrubs who looked bored. None of them were doctors. None of them looked like they'd just come from a trauma bay. Trevor saw me and his face shifted. The easy smile stayed, but something behind his eyes flickered. "Dad," he said, too loud. "You made it. Did you bring the checkbook?" I didn't answer. I looked at the woman in scrubs. "Where's the patient?" I asked. "Alyssa Morrison, car accident. Where is she being treated?" The woman glanced at Trevor, then at her computer. "We don't have anyone by that name admitted tonight." "Check again," I said. She typed. Her nails clicked against the keyboard. "No Morrison in the system. Not in the ER. Not in triage." I looked at Trevor. His jaw tightened. "She must be under a different name," he said quickly. "Maybe they admitted her under her insurance info." "What happened?" I asked. My voice was calm, flat. "I told you, Dad. Car accident. She's in surgery." "What hospital?" Trevor blinked. "What? If she's in surgery, what hospital is she at?" "Because you told me to come here, to St. Vincent's, and they're saying she's not here." The 2 young men had gone quiet. One of them started looking at his phone. "Dad, you're confused," Trevor said, his voice taking on that patient, explaining tone again. "You just got here. You're tired. Let's go outside and I'll explain." "I'm not confused," I said. I turned and walked back to my plastic chair. I sat down. I waited. Trevor followed me, his footsteps quick and uneven. "Dad, seriously, what are you doing?" "I'm waiting for you to tell me the truth," I said. He stared at me. For a long moment the only sound was the hum of the vending machines and the distant beep of monitors from somewhere deeper in the hospital. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A nurse walked past pushing an empty wheelchair. "I need the money," he said finally. His voice had changed. The panic was real now, but it wasn't the panic of someone whose girlfriend was hurt. It was the panic of someone who'd been caught. I'd heard that tone before, years ago, when he was 16, and I'd found the dent in the car he'd sworn he hadn't made. "For what?" I asked. He didn't answer. I stood up, tucked my checkbook back into my jacket pocket, and walked toward the exit. "Dad, wait, Dad, please." I pushed through the automatic doors into the cold November air. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove home. I didn't write the check. but I did start asking questions. That's when I realized this wasn't an emergency. It was a setup. The next morning, I walked into First National Bank at 9:03 a.m. I'd been banking there for 42 years. The branch manager, Sarah Chen, greeted me at her desk. "Good morning," she said. "What can I help you with today?" I sat down in the chair across from her. "I need to review my account activity for the last 6 months," I said. Her expression shifted, subtle, but I caught it. "Are you aware of the wire transfers going out of your account?" "Show me," I said. She turned the monitor. 10 wire transfers over 5 months, $8,500 each, all to Trevor Morrison. The most recent was 2 days ago. "That's $85,000, I said quietly. "Yes, all initiated online using your credentials." "Pull up the IP addresses," I said. She hesitated, then typed. "Multiple locations, coffee shops, public Wi-Fi." "Not from my home computer," I said. "No, I thought about my laptop. I kept it in my study, password protected." But Trevor had been to the house dozens of times in the past 6 months. He'd helped me set up a new router in July. He'd borrowed the laptop once to check his email while we had lunch. I trusted him. "Sarah," I said, "I didn't authorize these transfers." Her face went pale. In 42 years I'd never once disputed a transaction. She went very still. "Are you saying this is fraud?" "I'm saying I need copies of all the transaction records, and I need to freeze the account immediately." I sat at my kitchen table with the bank printouts spread in front of me, like evidence at a crime scene. The clock on the wall, a wedding gift from my late wife Ellen, ticked in the silence. It was the only sound in the house. It had been the only sound for 6 years now, since the cancer took her. By then I already knew the truth wasn't about money. It was about trust, and what happens when it breaks. I'd made a spreadsheet. The first transfer was August 14th. Trevor's car had broken down. Transmission repair. $8,500. He'd walked me through the wire transfer over the phone. I'd felt foolish, but I'd done it. September 2nd, Alyssa's dental emergency. September 19th, eviction threat. I hadn't authorized transfers 2 through 10, but they'd all come from my account. I opened my laptop browser history. August 15th, 2:47 a.m., a login to my bank. I'd been asleep. I checked the router logs. The login came from inside my house. Trevor's phone. He'd set my router up in July. That's when he got my login. Then I found something else. An old backup. Trevor forgot he'd left on my computer. The message was to Alyssa, dated November 10th. Asterisk got another 8.5K from the old man. He's so confused he doesn't even check his account. This is easier than I thought. I read it 3 times. Not Dad, not my father, not even him. The old man. He was setting a narrative, making me look confused. Senile. I called my lawyer. James Whitaker's office smelled like old books and coffee. He'd been my attorney for 20 years. He didn't smile when I walked in. "You sounded serious on the phone," he said. I handed him the folder. Inside were the bank statements, the transaction records, the router logs, and a printed timeline I'd created showing every call, every emergency, every request for money. James read in silence. It took him 15 minutes. I watched him work through the pages, his pen marking dates, circling amounts. He'd always been thorough. It was why I'd hired him 2 decades ago. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at me over his reading glasses. His expression was careful, controlled. "This is wire fraud," he said. "If you report this, Trevor could face federal charges." "I know," I said. He leaned back. "What do you want to do?" I'd been thinking about that all morning. "I want to know where the money went. I want to know if Trevor's in trouble, real trouble, or if this is something else. And then I want my money back. And I want to make sure he can't do this again." James nodded slowly. "We'll need a forensic accountant. Someone who can trace where those wire transfers ended up. If Trevor moved the money into another account, we can track it. If he spent it," he trailed off. "I need to know," I said. "Okay, I'll make some calls. In the meantime, you need to document everything. Every conversation, every text message, every call. If this goes to court, we'll need evidence that you didn't authorize these transfers." I pulled out my phone. "I've already started." James smiled for the first time. "Of course you have." 3 days later I sat in a conference room with James and Dr. Lisa Monroe, a forensic accountant. She was younger than I expected, mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a laptop covered in coffee stains. The kind of person who worked late nights. The money went to Trevor's account at Pacific Western Bank, she said, showing me a flowchart on her screen. From there it dispersed to 6 different accounts. 2 belonged to Marcus Chen and David Okoye, Trevor's friends. Their social media profiles show casinos, clubs, expensive dinners. The other 4 are Delaware LLCs, shell companies with no physical address. What's he buying? I asked. The withdrawal patterns suggest gambling debts or controlled substances. Cash only under $10,000 each time to avoid reporting. Can we recover it? If it's spent? No. But we can file fraud charges. I stood up. My legs felt heavy. Thank you, Dr. Monroe. By the time I left that room, I knew this wasn't just my son stealing. He wasn't alone. Trevor called at 9:15 p.m. Dad, I'm sorry about the hospital, he said. Alyssa's fine. She was at a different hospital. But I still need that money. No, I said. Silence. I'm in trouble. I owe people. Go to the police. I can't. Then I can't help you. He hung up. I didn't hear from Trevor for a week. The silence was heavier than I expected. Every time the phone rang, I thought it might be him. It never was. Then on November 18th, I received a letter. Legal stationery. Thick envelope. Return address from a law firm in Manhattan. It wasn't from Trevor. It was from a lawyer representing someone named Lawrence Chen, one of the names Dr. Monroe had found in the money trail. The letter accused me of interfering in a private business transaction and threatened legal action if I continued to harass Mr. Chen or his associates. I called James immediately. This is an intimidation tactic, he said, after reading the letter. They're trying to scare you into dropping the fraud investigation. It's not working, I said. Good, because we're ready to file. The next morning, James submitted a formal complaint to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The complaint included the bank records, the forensic analysis, the router logs, and the timeline showing Trevor's pattern of deception. We also filed a civil lawsuit against Trevor for the return of the $85,000 plus damages. The process took 3 days. On November 21st, 2 FBI agents showed up at Trevor's apartment. I didn't hear about it directly. I heard about it because Trevor called me at 11:47 p.m., screaming, "You called the FBI on me. Your own son? Are you insane?" I filed a fraud report, I said calmly. The FBI handles financial crimes. You're trying to send me to prison. I'm trying to get my money back. I'm your son, and I'm your father, not your ATM. He hung up. 10 minutes later he called back. This time he was crying. Dad, please don't do this. I'll pay you back. Every cent. Just drop the charges. Where will you get $85,000? I asked. I'll figure it out. How? Silence. Trevor, I said. If you're in real trouble, I'll help you, but not with money. If you're being threatened, if you're in danger, we can go to the police together. But I need the truth. I can't tell you the truth, he whispered. Then I can't help you. I hung up. The preliminary hearing was set for December 3rd. I sat in the federal courthouse, in a room that smelled like floor wax and anxiety. The wood benches were hard. The ceiling was high. Everything echoed. James sat next to me, his briefcase open on the table. Across the aisle, Trevor sat with a public defender, a young woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. She kept glancing at her watch. Trevor wouldn't look at me. He stared at his hands, folded on the table in front of him. The prosecutor laid out the case. Wire fraud, unauthorized access to financial accounts, $85,000 transferred over 5 months. The evidence was clear. Trevor had used my login credentials to move money without my knowledge or consent. Trevor's lawyer argued that I had given him the credentials, that I'd authorized the first transfer and simply forgotten about the others. She submitted a letter from a random clinic doctor suggesting that I might be experiencing early signs of memory loss. I felt my jaw tighten. James stood up. His chair scraped against the floor. The sound echoed in the quiet courtroom. Your Honor, we'd like to submit evidence. He handed the judge a folder. Inside were the router logs showing Trevor's phone accessing my account at 2:47 a.m. when I was asleep. The text message I'd found in his cloud backup, got another 8.5K from the old man. Screenshots of the wire transfers, the dates, the amounts, everything. And one more thing. My medical records. A full cognitive evaluation from 3 weeks ago, ordered by my primary care physician. Perfect score. No signs of dementia, no memory impairment. The judge read in silence. When she finished, she looked at Trevor. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "did you access your father's bank account without his permission?" Trevor's lawyer whispered something to him. He shook his head. "Mr. Morrison," the judge repeated, "answer the question." "Yes," Trevor said finally. His voice was barely audible. "And did you transfer $85,000 from his account into your own?" "Yes." The judge set down the folder. "I'm setting bail at $25,000. Your trial date is January 14th. Do you understand?" Trevor nodded. I stood up. My legs were steady. I didn't feel victorious. I felt older. Trevor made bail. 2 days later, he came to my house. He sat on the couch where he used to watch cartoons as a kid. The same couch where his mother had read him bedtime stories. The cushion on the left side still had a faint stain from where he'd spilled grape juice when he was 7. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "I owe people. Gambling debts. They threatened Alyssa." I panicked. "You could have come to me," I said. "You would have been disappointed." "I'm more disappointed now." He flinched. "If you'd told me the truth, I would have helped you," I said. "Not with money, but I would have helped. Instead, you tried to make me look incompetent." "I didn't mean, but you did." We sat in silence. "I'm not dropping the charges," I said. "But if you plead guilty and cooperate, I'll ask the judge for leniency." "Why?" "Because you're my son. I'm not giving up on you, but I'm not letting you destroy yourself." He nodded. "Thank you, Dad." I walked him to the door. The trial was in January. January 14th, a Tuesday. Snow was falling outside the courthouse windows. Trevor pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of probation, in order to repay the $85,000 through a structured payment plan. The courtroom was nearly empty. Just me, James, the prosecutor, and a handful of people I didn't recognize. No Alyssa, no friends. Trevor stood alone at the defense table. When the judge read the sentence, Trevor didn't react. He stood there, hands folded, and accepted it. Afterward, they led him away in handcuffs. He looked at me once as they took him through the side door. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just looked back. When he was gone, James put a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, Richard." "Did I?" I asked. "Yes." I wasn't sure I believed him, but I nodded anyway. "I still live in the house Ellen and I bought in 1984. 3 bedrooms, a study, a backyard with an old oak tree. We raised Trevor here, celebrated his birthdays, watched him graduate high school in the living room before the ceremony, fixing his tie. Last month I started volunteering at a financial literacy program, teaching young adults about budgets and boundaries, how to recognize when someone's manipulating you, how to say no. People ask if I regret reporting Trevor, if I miss him. The honest answer is yes. I miss the boy who asked me to explain compounding interest, but that boy became a man who saw me as a resource. I learned that love doesn't mean enabling. Sometimes it means letting them face consequences. Trevor writes from prison, short letters, apologies, progress reports. He's getting help. I write back. I don't send money, but I write back, because setting a boundary isn't the same as closing a door. At 1:17 a.m., my son wanted money. By morning he learned I wasn't his ATM.